Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be about Streptococcus pyogenes, one of the many types of Streptococcus. Here at the top we can see a picture of strep. It is in a chain, or I like to think about it as a strip because it sounds like strep. So there's a strip of cocci bacteria because they're circles, so they're cocci like the name says. And they're purple. I don't have any markers, but they're purple, which means they're what? Gram-positive, because they're keeping all of the ink inside, so they're positive for ink. And over here we can see a zoomed-in picture of one of the cocci. I read online that streptococci look fuzzy, and one of the reasons they look fuzzy is because of all of the M protein and fimbriae that are on the outside. So if you see them in a picture, they might look pretty fuzzy. And then there's a bunch of little fuzzy guys all together. So let's look at some of the characteristics of Streptococcus pyogenes. First, they're catalase negative. So this is one of the tests you can do to see what kind of bacteria you have. And catalase negative means they don't know what to do with hydrogen peroxide. So the way I'm remembering that is I'm thinking gargle with hydrogen peroxide to kill your strep throat. Now, I don't know how effective that is. I actually read online that you can do that with like a 3% solution of hydrogen peroxide. I don't think it's going to cure you, but if I get strep throat, I'm doing it next time. And that's how I'm remembering it's catalase negative. You have to remember for yourself that catalase is the test where you put hydrogen peroxide on some bacteria and see if bubbles come out. And bubbles will not be coming out here, so they're dying. The next is Streptococci have groups that they're categorized in. They have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, all the way to H, so A through H. But group A is the worst, so that's nice because they put it first. If it were like group G, that would be annoying. But it's group A is the worst, so let's look at group A. Group A strep is often abbreviated as GAS because everybody loves abbreviations and nobody wants to be reminded about what the word means. So GAS is beta hemolytic. Who remembers what beta hemolytic is? That is when you can lyse the blood cells in an agar plate. Usually it's apparently sheep's blood for some very good reason. Group G strep and group C strep can also lyse blood cells, so they're also beta hemolytic. But most of the time we're going to be seeing group A. So if you have something that fails the catalase test and is beta hemolytic on an agar plate, it's most likely going to be some type of group A strep. Next is bacitracin. So if you put this little antibiotic tab on your agar plate, it will kill the bacteria around it, and that's another indicator that this is probably Streptococcus pyogenes. What does bacitracin do? It stops BPP from carrying NAG and NAM across the phospholipid bilayer to elongate the peptidoglycan chain. So if bacteria are trying to reproduce and they can't make their NAG-NAM, then they can't make their peptidoglycan layer, and if you're gram-positive, that's an important part of your life cycle, so you're going to be in trouble. Okay, now let's look at some of the so-called virulence factors. So what makes Streptococcus such a powerful bacteria, and why does it hurt so bad when you have strep throat? Well, the first thing is it has fimbriae and M proteins. We talked about that when we looked at this picture up here because they're fuzzy. Well, apparently bacteria don't like to just be washed away down your throat into your digestive system, so they like to hang on. And so they use these fimbriae and M proteins to adhere to the host cells. And we're going to come back to the M protein. We have a little antibiotic here, not an antibiotic, I mean an antibody, sorry, binding to the M protein to remind us that these M proteins like to bind, or they don't like to bind, but we like to send antibodies to bind to the M proteins. That's one way that we can kill strep throat. Something else is they have something called an F protein. An F protein binds to fibronectin. So this is something in the outer, I think it's part of the glycocalyx of our cells outside of the phospholipid bilayer, and the fimbriae can bind to the fibronectin. So F protein, sorry, not the fimbriae, the F protein. So F protein binds to fibronectin, and fimbriae are different, but there's lots of F's here. So, okay, LTA, lipoteichoic acid, also helps with adhesion. So just remember that. We've got three things that help the bacteria bind to the host cell and let it stick around longer. Next, we've got streptolysin S and streptolysin O. And strep for strep throat or streptococcus, and lice. Hopefully you know lice means to cut or break apart. And what do these do? They can hemolyse phagocytes. So the phagocytes come along, they try and kill streptococcus, and oh boy, they just killed our phagocytes. That's really awful. They do this by breaking apart the lysozymes to kill the cells, or lysosomes. Next is streptokinase A and B. And these can dissolve blood clots. And some of the things that we're going to look at from 5, 6, and 7 are to help strep spread out and get to different areas. So if you've got a blood clot, Streptococcus pyogenes can't get through, it'll use its streptokinase. Next is hyaluronidase, and hyaluronic acid also helps hold things together, and Streptococcus doesn't like that. It wants to break through, and so hyaluronidase breaks through hyaluronic acid. And finally, DNase, because we learned in class that if a bunch of cells lyse and the DNA spills out, it's really sticky and makes a mess, and it's hard for the bacteria to get through. So they cut their way through using DNase. Up here, because we were running out of space, we stuck in that Streptococcus pyogenes has a C5a peptidase. And so a C5a peptidase will break apart C5a, and C5a will no longer work. So the C5a, normally I have here NCT, is a neutrophil chemotaxin. So a neutrophil chemotaxin would be something that tells neutrophils to come over. And you can think that if you have a strep infection, you'd probably want more neutrophils in the area, and so you're going to send out C5a, part of the complement cascade. But nope, strep said no. Denied. So think of something else, immune system. Well, the next thing maybe would have been C3b. Let's opsonize these guys. Nope. Number 9 virulence factor is M protein binds to factor H, and therefore there's no C3b. So I think the way this works is, if you remember, factor H is like a glue that helps keep the C3b together, whereas factor I cuts it apart. And I suppose if you get all the factor H and you bind it up, then all the factor I will start chopping things up and it'll slow down the complement cascade. But it said in the reading it binds to factor I. So it's hurting C5a and it's hurting C3b. So that's very unfortunate for anybody who has strep throat. Next are the complications, because as if strep throat wasn't bad enough, you could actually have something much worse. And those 3 things are scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, and glomerulonephritis. And if you haven't heard, rheumatic fever is just an old word for immunology. Before they knew what immunology was, they called it rheumatology. So I would actually rename this immune fever or something like that, or immunofever, if that helps your memory. But let's look at scarlet fever first. So what happens when you get scarlet fever? Well, you already have strep throat or something similar, and a bacteria gets into the virus. So the bacteria is invaded by a virus. That's a good thing, right? Well, it would be, unless these exotoxins were released from the bacteria, which is what happens, and this causes strawberry tongue and chest and extremities rash. So it's like strep throat, but you're on fire, and that's because the cells of the bacteria are breaking because viruses are there. Next is rheumatic fever, which we called immunofever. That was my name. It's not going to be on the test. But what happens? Well, you create all these antibodies to kill the strep, which probably are for M proteins, like we learned earlier. And what happens? Well, they don't just like to bind to the bacteria. They also like to bind to your joints, like your knees, and maybe even your heart, which would be really bad news. The last thing here, right before we get to 10 minutes, is glomerulonephritis. And that's when all these antibodies you were making for strep here get all caught up in the glomerulus, and it causes kidney problems, and you'll have to read an article about glomerulonephritis if you want to understand it in detail. But in general, you can just remember, look at all these antibodies up in here, blocking everything, causing you to have a bad day. Well, hopefully that helps you understand Streptococcus pyogenes a little bit better. Have a great day.